Have you ever watched or played Half-Life Alyx and then thought to yourself, the soundtrack is alright, but it doesn't hit like the old music? Well, in this video we'll talk just about that. If you still haven't played or watched Half-Life Alyx, I must warn you about minor spoilers ahead. To start this off, let's talk about the old soundtrack. The author of almost all music and sounds for old Valve games is the one and the only legendary Kelly Bailey. He almost single-handedly created music for all games in the Half-Life franchise, including Portal 1, except HLA obviously. His very distinct music consists out of electronic sounding synths and samples, sometimes realistic textures and sounds, heavily processed acoustic drums, electric guitars, and very rarely different real instruments. Kelly Bailey didn't create all of his music from scratch, of course. He uses samples from old music a lot. I absolutely love when he uses fitting sounds, which shouldn't be just ambient, inside a soundtrack and alters them so you can grasp their nature. This makes different soundtracks very thematic and you feel them even outside of the game. While researching for this video, I stumbled upon the exact sample pack he used for Half-Life soundtrack. It is called Altered States. Bailey used it even for the very famous intro music, Hazardous Environments. Huge thanks to this guy for letting me use his video. If you wanna see the full version, it's in the description. Kelly Bailey's soundtrack is constantly swinging between two extremes: catchiness and atmosphere. Energetic events and most of the fun in the game happen together with very rhythmic tracks and catchy minimalistic melodies. What I love about these tracks is that you can jam to them outside of the game. They're just this good. Complete opposite of the above, these tracks deliver ominous, cryptic, lonely, empty, surreal and depressive feelings. They immerse you into the game's universe, environments and places. They usually play in parts of the game where you're investigating, in moments of solitude between gunfights, or when something important to the plot happens. These tracks are the best to work or relax to. They often serve as blank canvas, open to interpretation for the player. His skill of making insanely large feeling, one-of-a-kind melodic ambiences and super energetic memorable tracks is outstanding and one of the kind. The mood that Bailey creates with them highlights the universe of Half-Life. It makes you feel like something is just not right, like there is something off in it, but it's still hope. It is comparable to the weird sight of alien combined technology next to a very familiar cozy place or house. It's been decades and we're still getting his music used and remixed. I believe it says a lot. But I do strongly believe that the most valuable thing in his work, however, is not the uniqueness of sound design, but fantastic melodies that are all around the soundtracks. Mike Morasky is a very different composer to Bailey. First of all, his past projects do not consist only of weird ominous atmospheres, depressive melodies and badass industrial rock. He is well known for making goofy and upbeat music for Team Fortress 2. I must especially highlight the Team Fortress 2 soundtrack, which he directed for an orchestra. Absolute treat for years. It became an integral part of Team Fortress, and I don't think that we can imagine TF2 without it anymore. He also worked on Portal 2 music, and it's phenomenal. From clever uses of synths to melodies, he truly brings something new and unexplored to the Portal franchise. As much as I like the old Valve soundtrack, Mike Morasky did a much better job at bringing character and life into Portal 2 than Bailey did with the first one. First Portal's music was more like a placeholder than anything else. However, I should mention one particular track by Bailey from the first chapter that shines with its excellence, the one that truly highlights the depressive loneliness of the first game, Self-Esteem Fund. It is yet another example of extraordinary skills of Kaylee Bailey's atmosphere building. Marvelous piece. Anyway, let's get back to Mike. Morasky, while being very different to Bailey, nails all the elements Half-Life games have, but a little differently. He also uses electronic sound in synths and samples, although I noticed that he likes synths more. He uses realistic textures and sounds, but rarely. Acoustic drums are present, but in another form, in a completely different mood. Electric guitars are here too. One of the biggest differences from old soundtrack, orchestral instruments. Morasky loves using them. And I must emphasize this, cellos and strings are all around the soundtrack. Morasky's approach is again different. He uses suspense and mystery to bring the game to life. The mysterious atmosphere of some parts is insanely well done. Action is plain but suspenseful. Morasky is constantly building it up. But there are some action tracks that are reminiscent to the older games. Morasky's melodies are extremely simple and very long, sometimes even just 2 or 3 notes. Bailey also has some super minimalistic tracks, but Morasky has more of those in Alyx. Nonetheless, he did a few full-fledged melodies that are actually really good. Morasky mostly succeeds in the integral element of the music of Half-Life universe, to show that something is off, but fails a little to show the human nature in it. Now, with most of objectivity out of the way, after you listen to examples, I can finally tell you what I had in the back of my mind for months. I think that Mike Morasky's music is good. At times you forget about music in HLA just because you're so focused on the game's exploration, and you're like, yeah, it's alright, pretty thematic. But once you pay attention to the music, the feeling of it mostly trying to solve a problem of filling the void and not telling anything never leaves. It's not like Bailey didn't do the same in some parts, he totally did, but nonetheless he tried to tell something with atmospheric pieces. I don't know if I can tell that about Morasky's soundtrack. Thematic sounds help a bit, but not too much. I noticed that the game is straight up afraid to leave the player in silence. Bailey does this constantly in older games. Does it make it worse? No, it makes games better. It adds breathing room. Pauses between music make the next music piece feel more important and impactful.
But there's something missing. Like I've illustrated, there is a lot of music in Half-Life Alyx. Stems consistently create pacing for the game, and they introduce new elements as you progress through the level and encounter new challenges. Even in Chapter 1, there are stems for a Strider towering over you and a gunship flying through the air. There aren't nearly as many moments of calm, although they do exist in areas where the game feels like you can handle things on your own, and I savor those moments. But losing regular moments of silence diminishes a primary philosophy established time and time again in previous soundtracks.
All music in Half-Life 1, 2 and episodes is 2 hours and 27 minutes long combined. And all these games take about 33 hours to play through if playing blindly. Half-Life Alyx is about 12 hours in length, but its soundtrack is almost twice as long as the old one, 4.2 hours. You would think a fan should be happy about that, but here we are. Because of the above, Morasky's music is less memorable. You would ask yourself, but why did they do that? Valve devs aren't dumb, of course.
So, funnily enough, another thing that I wanted to talk about before we might actually get into some of the nitty-grittiness behind the actual composition and things like that, is that Half-Life, I think, as opposed to something like Portal, which we've spoken about before, is a lot more musically silent. Like, I felt like music was a lot more constant in the background in Portal, whereas Half-Life, it seems a lot more sparing. When do you make the decisions on when music is appropriate, and even ambiences, because at times it can go from outright silence into an ambience in the background. So when do you decide when something's appropriate?
Especially, I was super aware of how Half-Life was very sparing in the music. And then the music was, like I said, purposely sort of this open canvas. I did some tests early on, so like 2.5 years ago or whatever. I would put different types of music in the game just in places, and man, the opinions coming out of the people that I was testing on, meaning my colleagues, were really strong, and many of them were very anti-music, to be totally honest. Like that, it totally brings me out of the immersion of the game, so on and so forth. And VR was super new to everybody, so I kind of took that all very seriously, and it took me quite a while to figure out. There was a couple of spots in the game where it was supposed to get exciting, like when the alarm first goes off. You're in the laundry room and the alarm goes off, and basically you're supposed to kind of move on, basically, and the combine are running around and whatnot, and people were not really paying attention to the alarm or to the excitement at all. Like they would be, futzing with the laundromat and just playing around, which some people still do, which is fine. But from a sort of cinematic and storytelling standpoint, it just wasn't moving. And so I tried sneaking some kind of classic cinema pulse music in the background. And lo and behold, playtest people just were like, oh, I gotta go. Like there's something happening. I need to move, right? And I slowly but surely, and I knew this, and I was verbalizing it, the idea that we're not actually making reality, we're making entertainment. And so putting music in that form makes a lot of sense. And people started to notice it and going, oh my God, that's great. Actually, that really helps. It, serves a function from a game standpoint, from a pacing standpoint. Over time, the request for music went from basically like, don't put music in. It makes it too scary, which definitely I got some of it in the early days. B, it removes the immersion or it takes me out of the location. To, fast forward to the end to where I think there was a lot of level designers that would have liked to have music in more places. But so, if you look at that as the sort of overall arc of where the viewpoint, my personal viewpoint from testing and watching playtesters and then working with all of my colleagues, like it sort of progressed from basically almost no music to, the desire for there to be a lot. With that all in mind, I kind of started just looking for opportunities, B, but sort of like if you look at I made a giant spreadsheet and tried to spread it out so that it represented sort of the overall time of the game and the things that were happening in the game, and then made sure that the music, that there were no giant deserts, big like spaces that went on for too long without some music, and then also look for spots where music could help to move it forward. And then the obvious ones where it's like, oh, there's something happening here. Is there something we can do with music to make it more impactful?
And okay, I understand that, but that doesn't help music at all. I honestly believe that there could be other tricks to bring people's attention to objectives. Music shouldn't suffer. Morasky put some references to the old soundtrack in HLA actually. You can clearly hear Particle Ghost in Hideout Puzzle very clearly. Most of Kelly Bailey's music has an episodic nature. Every track has a beginning and an end. You might say that it is its downside, but I actually think it's very good for the feel of the game. Mike Morasky's soundtrack for Alyx doesn't have defined edges. The idea behind it is very cool and should certainly be explored more, but unfortunately it is misused a lot in Alyx. Another thing that Morasky's music unfortunately achieves is being less listenable outside of the game. It might be great as a background for something, but not more than that. You would sometimes have a hard time defining what is ambient and what is actual music in Alyx, because it flows in and out seamlessly. While it is one of his advantages, I believe his love of classical instruments is one of his weaknesses when it comes to making Half-Life music. Half-Life soundtrack is known for its catchy industrial rock, clever use of samples, textures and solid melodies. Not for great orchestration. Yes, I agree that if the soundtrack was completely the same, it would be wrong. I respect him for making something completely new and trying out different things, but even considering all of this, I don't think it holds up against Bailey's music. I think that Kelly's Bailey soundtrack is an integral part of Half-Life and even more success. As much as I love the lore, game visuals, gameplay, physics, gunplay, etc., I cannot say that Half-Life would be the same without its sounds and music. To finish this video on a bright note, maybe it sounds like I didn't like the music in the Half-Life Alyx, but you're wrong. It's fun, the ambiences are fantastic, and many parts from sound effects to sound design are clever and neat. However, comparing it to the old soundtrack, it's I think what I've been trying to say this whole video is that we got a good soundtrack in HLA, maybe even a great one, but not a masterpiece Kelly Bailey created.